Okay, so we have a lot to cover today. And you'll notice that today we're introducing a new topic. For those of you who have, sat in on many of our webinars, we have a common theme where first we cover the CTDL, the Credential Transparency Description Language, and we always move on to new topics with that. And so, we do have kind of a recap from the last webinar where we talked about the cost manifest proposal, but we've got a couple of new topics, including one that Stuart Sutton is going to talk about, and that's how moving forward through a process that will lead to a proposal to a W3C committee for schema.org. And also the credentialing ecosystem mapping team we're going to put under CTDL, and Alex Jackal has joined us, who's a member of that team, as well as we probably have others like Jim Goodell, who is part of the team. And so when we get there, it would be great if maybe Alex could talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about competency frameworks, and we're going to talk about the ADL CAS Credential Engine partnership that will then keep on the agenda ongoing each month, and our Credential Registry update, so we'll move on to a new topic there. And if we have time, I'll just fill everybody in on the partner update as well. And as I said, please do feel free to ask questions. This webinar is being recorded. We have Scarlett scribing as well. And after the webinar, for anyone who this might be your first time joining, hi Fritz, we always make sure you get access to the Google Drive with all the materials. You'll receive your follow-up email as well with the PowerPoint attached. And if discussions come up, we'll put them in the Google group and GitHub, depending on the discussion or the issue, to follow up on as well. So let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen. I'm going to go ahead and get my PowerPoint going here. Can everyone see my screen? I've got the PowerPoint. This says TAC meeting May 26, 2017.
Yes, I can see it. We can see it.
Okay, great. Then let me just... Okay, good. Okay, and again, this PowerPoint, it's already in the Google Drive, and we'll email it to everyone as well. You don't have to have a copy for the webinar. Let me go ahead and move on to the CTDL section here, and Nate Argo, who's on, is going to, and Stuart may have a couple of things to say as well, but just very quickly, we just kind of want to recap where we're at with the cost manifest that is now pending. Nate? Nate, we don't hear.
Yeah, okay, so last month we introduced, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So last month we introduced Cost Manifest as a new profile in CTDL, and the associated properties, Common Costs and Has Cost Manifest. And the idea here is that this will work basically just like the Condition Manifest profile, in the sense that you have an organization that will establish these Cost Manifest profiles, and these Cost Manifest profiles will contain the existing cost profile class from CTDL. The difference, of course, being that then you can have multiple credentials, assessments, learning opportunities, and so on, all reference these sort of organization-level costs rather than duplicating or encoding those costs individually into each of those other records. So that if you have a change in your policy, or one of your costs for whatever reason changes, you don't have to go then and update all of those other records, because they all just point at the single cost manifest thing that sits at your higher level. Go to the next slide.
This is an example.
And so here we've got a just kind of a diagram. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think there's a delay on my end. So here you can see that you have an organization that offers a credential, and or I guess it's in this case they're learning opportunities. So they offer these 2 learning opportunities, and both of these learning opportunities have the same base set of costs. Now they could have additional costs that are specific to themselves as well, but they have the same basic set of costs, and you can see in the arrows on kind of the left there, they both point to the same cost manifest profile, which in turn contains a bunch of cost profiles, which again were the existing class in CTDL that contains all of the sort of details about those costs. And so here we've got several links to, well, the GitHub issue where the cost manifest stuff was discussed and developed, as well as the links to the cost manifest in pending, and again, the related properties. Common cost being the one that everything else would use to point to the cost manifest profile, and has cost manifest being the one that the organization uses to say, hey, this is my cost manifest. This is the one that I manage.
Okay. And so this is, we had presented the cost manifest during the prior TAC meeting, and so there's a full presentation that gets into a whole lot more detail about it. This is just intended as a follow-up and to, again, encourage any comments, as we do expect to release that edition that's now on pending as a release on June 30th. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that? If not, I'd like to hand it over to Stuart Sutton to talk a little bit about the process for the thin credential profile to propose for a W3C community for schema.org, and that is a mouthful.
Okay. As we know from the beginning, one of the goals in structuring or modeling the CTDL somewhat around the basic tenets of the schema.org project and the schema.org schema itself. CTDL, or CE, was committing itself to pursuing an extension to schema.org for credentials. So I just want to do a very, very brief intro to that, how we see the process, that process unfolding in front of us. It'll take a number of months, and so we'll be returning to this. So I'll try and be brief because we do have a full agenda. So I'll talk a little about what is schema.org, how the search engines use it, and talk a little bit about the Credential Engine's goals, and how we intend to approach an extension proposal. So you can go ahead, Gene. I thought I would just take some text from the opening page of, or the about page for schema.org to give you a sense of what it is, if you're not aware. I'm looking down the list of people on the call. I think most people know what it is. But anyway, in 2011, a group of the major search engines, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and the Russian search engine Yandex, reached an agreement within the constraints of law, and to agree on a set of terms to be developed in a single namespace that they would recognize in metadata markup of web pages. This was a big, big move because a number of us have been working in metadata for the web or the internet for a long time, and the search engines have been very, very reluctant to adopt for many good reasons, spamming, all sorts of reasons. So in 2011, when Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Yandex agreed to do this, to use a common vocabulary for markup, it was a big deal. And to give you a sense of how big a deal, there are over 10 million sites now using it since 2011, so it is being used extensively. The schema itself is not developed by Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Yandex. It's actually put together by a collaborative open community. Anyone can participate in its development. So anyway, There is in schema.org a core vocabulary, a core set of entities and entity properties. And then communities, specific communities, can declare or design extensions that they can then propose to schema.org for adoption. And credentials is the extension we're basically talking about now. Those extensions are managed through, primarily today, are managed through public discussions in W3C community groups, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. So anyway, it is big and it is important. So from the beginning, as I said, we have built the CTDL around many of the core entities from schema.org. So we are in a prime place to do a mapping out of the larger CTDL vocabulary to a thin set of properties and classes that target search and discovery on the web. So Gene, you can flip to the next. So this is a quote from Dan Brickley. Schema.org is all about simplifying things for mass adoption. All of the properties in one namespace. It has to be such that the, as they say, webmaster can create and create markup using it simply. So there can't be huge learning curves. So they really mean it. It has to be simple, and the focus is on search and discovery. We know that CTL has a focus that is well beyond search and discovery. It includes search and discovery, but it also includes management and a whole bunch of other things that would not come into play with the proposal for a credential extension. Next, Gene. So currently, I want to talk just a little bit about other types of entities that are already in schema.org and what we see coming down the pike now. Learning resources was an early adoption into, that's the LRMI. It was an early adoption into schema.org. And recently, I don't know whether Phil, yeah, I see Phil is there. Recently, Phil Barker shepherded a W3C community through to course adoption, and I think that happened within the last month. So learning resources and course are already covered. Of the other things in our general neighborhood are competency frameworks and credentials. And what is happening now is the DCMI LRMI group. LRMI is looking at competency frameworks and doing a thin set of properties to describe competency frameworks, and Credential Engine, us, are looking at credentials. So here's a bill, Gene. So what I'm hoping we're able to do is, these two communities are pretty close. There are a number of people on the call here today that are also in the DCMI LRMI group. So it's a fairly tight-knit community. And what we would like to do is possibly develop them through two W3C community groups, somewhat in parallel, so we can sort of build and perhaps make the learning curve of one creating such an extension and socializing it through the W3C community structure, make that learning curve a little bit easier. So the general process we're kind of looking at is developing use cases, scope to search, discovery, develop a draft proposal building off use cases, schema.org types, and of course CTDL, the CTDL language, which already exists, and many properties are already demonstrate their mapping to schema.org. So create then a W3C community group, publish the draft proposal using schema.org mechanisms, and then shepherd community engagement and draft responsive updates. And then finally, when we're satisfied with that, everybody is satisfied as satisfied as people can get when they're working toward consensus, submit it to schema.org as a proposed extension. That 6-month time frame is a time frame I slapped on it. Phil Barker is on. He's muted there, but he could probably give you an idea. It felt like the coursework took that long, mainly because you're working not in the constraints of a project, even the size of this one, but in the open. And so things take time in order to process them. So anyway, I'm estimating that maybe this process will take about 6 months. And then we can be pleasantly surprised if it doesn't. Not too surprised if it takes 9. You never know. You never know how it's going to work out. I think that's, Jean, do you want to go on? But I think that's pretty much it. This is a slide, if you're not familiar with the extension process, how you develop and propose an extension. For a long time, it was quite mysterious, and and Richard Wallace has produced a number of blogs, which are the last 3 bullets, part 1, part 2, and part 3, around this process. And then there are 2 webinars. I apologize; they're an hour and 16 minutes long each, but they're pretty thorough on how this process of extension works. So if you're interested, you want to grab the PowerPoint for this. That's all I have to say at the moment. We'll have 6 months to talk about it. So
Yeah.
Sure, Alex. What? Yeah. Well, no, I think I Alex, I think that you're right on. I mean, now the structure of this is approached in terms of things like we're going to get into in a bit. This actually new project that is looking at a fairly massive crosswalking of standards. So it's relatively new and is of considerable scale. And if we look at what like preliminary thinking with the LMI thoughts on the competency framework, and also look at the casework coming out of IMS, all of those projects have, to a certain extent, looked across the ecosystem at how others have been doing them. So the competency framework is actually an area where there's been a lot of thought given to, for example, how does ASN map to case? How does case map to in-lock? How does in-lock? All of those will be good fodder. So I think we have to, Alex, keep all of that in mind. And you're right. I mean, it may actually mean that in this new work, which you'll be seeing in a moment, folks, might consider another column for schema.org.
Yeah, that was a really good suggestion, Alex. So we should carry that over into our meeting later today for sure. There's a lot going on in the chat there. Are there things, questions? It looks like there's a lot of discussion focusing on competency stuff, which is really cool. Are there things coming up that we need to talk about here and address? Any questions? I did, trying to follow the thread here. Um, Carla, you asked if there's a focus primarily on post-secondary. So following the thread, I'm not totally sure what the context of that is, but for, I think, speaking on Credential Engine, and I think Stuart could talk about this also as well, is
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
it's any
I
level. And then also distinct, there's we have, people tend to focus on K-12 and then post-secondary, so those are great examples, as well as usage. And so usage of frameworks for the purpose of identifying like knowledge, skills, abilities, those kinds of things for people, but also frameworks that are not necessarily used for measuring an outcome for a person, but for, say, benchmarking, other frameworks would also be included. So I think it's meant to be include all
I
of
would
those.
add that I don't know from my time spent with competency frameworks that at the data level
Mm-hmm.
there is any distinction between K-12, higher ed, workforce development. At the data level, those distinctions aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
Projects tend to focus. For example, ASN focused on K-12 because that's what they were funded to do. And CASE focuses somewhat on K-12, but there's nothing in the CASE schema that says it isn't perfectly applicable elsewhere. So
Mm-hmm.
now that may mean, when I say that, there may be an occasional property that may be more prevalent or exist in one, but the underlying data models are I don't find them to be distinguishable. Anyway, oh yeah, we're going right into this piece. This is new, so that's what we were talking about, this credential
Right.
user system mapping project, folks. So I'll now shut up.
Well, yeah, and then anybody, if we missed like a
Yeah,
question, because
that
there's a
would be
lot of
good.
good conversation in the chat, but
That's
I'm
good.
not
Yeah.
sure if any of
And
them are questions specifically that you want answered now or want to talk about
I
now. So
think
feel free to turn on your
it's very
audio if you would
interesting. And
like to discuss anything. Otherwise, let's go ahead and push on
actually,
to this
watching the
mapping
chat,
project. And
where
Alex, what I basically did was I took our scope
this
document
whole
and I put it in a couple of slides here. But if
question
you'd
of, well,
like
is
to,
it higher ed? Is it and there's competencies, and then in relationship to the credentials, and I think one of the issues that we're dealing with is somewhat a boiling the ocean question, right? And you have a lot of people doing very similar work across but in different interest groups. We just had ubiquitous, just jump on board, right? The mapping and in the medical area, and we have people working on HR open standards and things in higher ed, and in K-12 there's groups that are working in K-12 particularly on competencies, not so much credentials as much as competencies, right? But that's happening, and I think the goal is a bunch of us, different groups that are working on this, met with Jeannie, with Bob, with Jim from CDS, from a whole bunch of us. Greg Nadeau representing his Open Salt project, the IMS casework, right? So there was a bunch of us that met at the PESC conference and during the academic credentialing task force meeting, which I chaired, we actually sort of came together and agreed to this mapping project, and the Credential Engine people, Jean, Scarlett, particularly, thank you very much, for have been doing yeoman's work of providing the Google Drive and providing, sort of the operational support for it, and we're having our first organizational meeting this afternoon, and the goal is to try and see where we can collaborate, where we can harmonize, where we can interoperate among these various initiatives, working on credentials. And there's an unfortunately large amount of them, and we'll be working. One of the things we'll be doing today is we'll be sort of starting to look at what do we start with in terms of mapping between the mapping for 2 points. One, not to boil the ocean of mapping every element to every element for everything necessarily, but to look at these organizations, look at what the use cases are that are shared, and then from those key use cases, map key data elements and key data structures. And the idea is to be more open than more closed. Even though being more open, as we all know, increases time to get things done and increases complexity, but
yeah, thank you, Alex. That was really great. Thanks for
the goal is
really
actually
appreciate it. And I do want to add that Medvicuous and I believe EdFi have also joined, and so I believe both representatives from both groups will be joining today. So I would add those to the slide as well, so we don't want anyone to infer that it's a closed group. And in initial discussions, though, it was decided just for the sake of having a method to the madness, that we would begin with the kind of key U.S. models, standard schemas, but not limit it to that. And so we're not saying that we won't go to look at the European standards as well. I think there's a great interest in that, but we wanted to, there's so much to look at, as you could tell from those slides, that we need to have a starting point. So especially since we have Phil on here, I wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of that. Anybody else have any comments or questions? And anybody who want to speak, audio is on.
Hey, Jeannie, this is Jeff Gran. Just
Hi, Jeff.
+1 all around on making this happen. It's so important for institutions like ours to feel confident in the investments we're making for interoperability. So the crosswalks, fabulous. with all you technical people on the call, I have a question. Could this in the future become a federated publication of some sort using that would use linked data properties to do same as relationships across specs so that there's not a high risk of instrumenting with one particular way? There's easy ways
Those
that the data could be translated into
things
other
need to be
needed.
It's something that all these organizations, if we could agree upon and all pile on
No,
and get behind the schema that whatever
I would say that does
whatever gets
sound
generated
like something that could come out of
for
this.
schema.org, that could
So
be very
yeah,
powerful.
you know, and I think some of that is already happening, and maybe this is a good primer for Fritz, who will be speaking in a moment as well.
I don't know what else is actually.
And your
I could read the
point,
slides.
that,
People can read the slides,
investments
right? But
are
it's
being made in whether or not your secondary,
bottom line is
certificate or
we've got
certification program,
this
decisions
task
on
force, this mapping
technology, what to
team.
buy or
We're
what
going
to
to
create are critical, and so
be meeting regularly. We're going to be
beneficial win-win for all involved.
Making priorities based on use
that
cases.
we can ease the burden of those decisions, and I know at the IMS Global Conference,
and then we're going to start
no more walled gardens.
Actually focusing on whatever we
discussion going on. So I think that's the idea.
Decide as a priority. Start building maps
that we all want
with
to be able to achieve to the best that can be achieved.
intentions. One is to create
Anybody disagree, or
gap
are
analysis.
we on the right track?
Because it might be that all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, those credential engines people are so smart. They realize we needed this and we don't have it. Or, oh my God, can you believe those credential engines people? They're morons. Why did they actually add all that useless trivia to that thing, right? And we'll do a gap analysis, and then from that gap analysis, actually all the standards should improve. Right? And we can also then start to harmonize so that the crosswalks between them are much easier to do. And then we can start building we can start actually building shared structures, shared functions, and that the whole, hopefully this will truly.
Can I, Gene?
Yes, go ahead.
One question I have, and of course this initiative is new. I mean, it's only been how many weeks? It's literally wasn't it started in D.C. It's not been around very long. One consideration that is how will this group communicate out its stuff? Here we're sitting inside CTDL, or a credential engine, and we're talking about it here. Will it have an existence, a presence, where others from out who aren't, dedicated or functioning within this community to input and stuff with it? Did that make any sense? What kind of an organizational structure?
Or Jim Goodell is on. I
communicate and things.
And other people.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Jeannie? Or do you want me to?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next section that was intended to build off this conversation, and I want to preface it with just kind of painting a big picture. This is a look back of things that we've talked about in each TAC meeting, kind of covering chunks of it. And you know, with the Credential Engine services examples, including the CTDL, the Credential Registry, and Competency Registry, you know, authentication management to all of any of the services, things like the Work at App, Search App Prototype, and other developer tools. So I wanted to first give context and just kind of a reminder of some of the things that we've been talking about in the past. And then Jono and Fritz, do you both have audio? I would like to introduce Jono Poltrak with ADL, Advanced Distributed Learning, and Fritz Ray, who works with Robbie Robson with EduWorks on the CAS project that was sponsored by ADL. And I know Damon is on as well. So Damon, I am not trying to leave you out. If you have audio and would like to speak, please feel free to go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? This is Jono.
Hi, Jono. Yes.
Great. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to do a real brief intro. I won't get into too many details. And by the way, if anybody on the call is interested in more details, feel free to reach out to us because we like to talk about this stuff for hours at a time. But the Competency and Skills System, or CAS project, as you mentioned, is an ADL, which is a Department of Defense initiative project. And if you wonder how Fritz and EduWorks come in, it was an ADL-funded project being performed by EduWorks. So it's actually Fritz and Robbie and the guys that are actually working on the CAS project in conjunction with the greater ADL initiative. And, you know, we had a lot of interesting requirements going into this project. And one of the requirements that was a non-requirement was don't build another competency standard because, as we just talked about, there's a lot out there, and mapping these can be a big problem. So CAS intentionally did not try to start with here's another format, but there are a whole bunch of other use cases that emerge out of you know, a competency specification and using these within a real environment. Also, one thing just to point out ahead of time is that this is all open source. So I think the link is there on the slide. Yeah, the casproject.org site. Feel free to go out there and check any of this stuff out also on your own. So yeah, so a few use cases that you see there with CAS: competency portability for credentials, HR, and other. Shared learner models. This is something that ADL is a bit interested in, but I think might be a little bit out of scope for our conversations here. This is actually tying in the learner and some of their experience data and overlapping that with competencies. And then something that's, I think, pretty important to this conversation is having global persistent competencies for applications that you can reference, that you know are going to be there, that are in a registry/repository. I know the terminology can cause some problems. I would call it a registry, but in a registry out there of metadata of these things that you can count on being there, and then actually drill down and learn things about. So in addition to doing these things, CAS does a lot of other things, and I know you pointed this out a minute ago when translation came up. Fritz will probably talk a bit more about this, but in addition to providing those ideas where you can actually access competency frameworks and competencies, CAS actually does support multiple different competency frameworks. So for example, you could start with Medviquidus and then ask later for ANSI. And I know Fritz might be falling over at this point because I know that it's not a clean transition between some of these things, but generally that is the idea, to do a mapping. And obviously you should be participating, and I'm talking to the folks doing that mapping project because that has an obvious impact on the translation in CAS. And it does a bunch of other stuff, which I mentioned, like the learner models, etc. But again, I don't think that's necessary for right now. And if you want more details, reach out to me. And with that, Fritz, I'm going to turn it over to you to go into some more details.
Sure. So we're bringing to the table technologies and services in hopes of supporting the Competency Registry. A few of those things are that we have a JSON LD compatible repository that we can store competency data in multiple forms, pretty much any form that supports linked data. We're providing APIs and libraries to help store those competencies, retrieve them, and as well translate or transmute between the various competency standards and formats. And then the third thing that we have that we're bringing a little bit less of is that we have a bunch of tools for creating and managing these competency frameworks. Those are sort of public out on the web. They won't be necessarily as prominent in the Competency Registry. We'll probably do something a little bit more specialized towards that. But this is all to support a lot of what's been talked about up till this point, being able to sort of transmute between these various competency formats, these competency standards. That's why we're involved in that the mapping group, and that's what we're looking to do. So.
Go on to the next.
I guess one other thing to point out is that CAS is it's a distributed system. So if you're wondering if there's just one CAS node out there that everybody uses, that's not necessarily the case. That they are meant to have multiple instances that work together.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
And Fritz and Nate kind of worked on this the other day. Do you two want to kind of talk through? I know this has a little animation here, and I can click when you need me to click.
Okay. So, did you want to start off, Nate, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. All right. So real quick here, I guess you can hit the first mouse button there, or the first animation rather. Okay. So in the middle here, we have kind of the Credential Engine, and there's a few different pieces here. There's a Credential Engine account that an organization would use to access all the things in here. The Credential Engine would, of course, have the registry, which is the repository of credential metadata, which you can see kind of in the upper right there. And then it would also have a repository of competency metadata, which is in the sort of lower center there. Now that competency metadata would be built out, at least at first, using the CAS tool. Go ahead and click again. So CAS has put together this really nice way of creating and aligning competencies to not only build out the sort of relationships between them, but between competencies in one framework and competencies in another framework. And all of that data would be stored within the competency metadata repository, as a part of our sort of competency registry, all of which exists within the Credential Engine. So if you want to go ahead and click again, please. And the way that this would be used is that you would have the credentials you see in the upper left there would reference the metadata, or the competency metadata in the other store. And they could also reference third-party hosted competency metadata that is not within the registry. That's all done through the credential alignment object. So you see we've got the third-party host they've got their competency metadata. They're not using the registry, but we can reference them just the same as we could for competencies that are in it. So go ahead and click one more time here. And all of that enables us to create this sort of ecosystem you see here, where on the far left you've got the organization that is using their Credential Engine account to sort of manage and access and do all of this. You've also got the third parties on the right, and you've got on the far right there the third-party developers or applications. So those could be websites, those could be apps, those could be whatever else. It's sort of one of our goals is to foster this marketplace of these sort of third-party applications that leverage the data that we're putting together. And so you see down all the way at the very top there, you have the end user who is making use of the websites, the apps, the tools that these organizations have put together and made available, all of which leverage the data that's in the registry that CAS has helped us put together. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of a complex diagram there. And Fritz, did you have anything to add before we move on? Yeah.
Sure.
Well, let me just say a couple things, this Jeannie. So the CAS, as we said, ADL has funded CAS as an open source system, and so EduWorks is working with us on that. But the Credential Engine will offer, as I showed in that slide a couple slides back, the services. And so the Credential Engine, as a part of its role, will be hosting technologies, in the cloud. So that's did I answer? Okay. Sure. And then, Nate, can you talk a little bit about this slide here? Because I think people, it's like a point of confusion as to why there's different repositories for this metadata and how they interact, if they interact at all.
Sure. Real quick though, I just want to make sure that Fritz, did you have anything to add to the previous slide before we move on to this one?
No, that was spot on. One of the things that I will point out is
Okay.
one of the reasons why the mapping group is so important is because there's not a lot of people doing these translations in this diagram, and so we're going to have third-party developers and applications that like to speak one language, talking to competencies that have been stored in another one. So having these mappings is incredibly important.
Good point.
Right. Okay, so this second diagram here is kind of a focus or a zoom in on the right half of the previous diagram, where you see on the left side here we've got the credential, which has says that it requires various competencies that are listed here on the left. And then over on the right, we've got two different sources of competencies. Now, the top right one would be sort of the ideal case, where we have a competency framework that is all done in fully accessible, in this case, JSON LD, or sort of a minified version of it for the sake of saving space in the example. But essentially, it's data, it's raw data that machines can access and make use of directly. So that's stored in the actual competency registry. And you see we've got these arrows here so that both of the top two competencies point to the framework itself, and then they each individually reference specific competencies within that framework. And through that sort of mechanism, that's the way that the alignment object works, we can point to those competencies without having to carry all of the data that's associated with them over into the actual record itself. And then down at the bottom right, we have sort of a different case where a lot of the competencies that we've encountered so far are not really even on a web page. They're in a PDF file. So there's no way to get to the individual competencies. So currently the best we can do is point to the PDF as the quote-unquote framework. So that's what we've got here. See the purple arrow points to the PDF file as being the framework, as a means of allowing you or a consuming system to go and retrieve that data and then pick through it and do whatever they would need to do with it. But the PDFs have obviously an irregular structure that is usually more visual, more document oriented than anything data related. So a lot of the work that Fritz just mentioned that we'd have to do is pulling data out of these PDFs and out of sometimes Word documents or web pages if we're lucky, and putting them into a more structured data format like you see on the top right. And that's one of the use cases, or one of the purposes, I guess, for the CAST tool. And then of course in the bottom-most part of the right, or the left side of the diagram here, that competency, the fourth one, it doesn't exist anywhere that you can retrieve. It's sort of the worst case scenario where you have to use the alignment object to store the competency itself, the name, description, coded notation, everything about it. It's not ideal, but the object does provide that capability, to handle that situation as well. But what we want to get to is the top two here, where it's structured data that we can point to, and that way you could have multiple credentials and whatever else, all point to competencies that all live in one.
Question about.
Very good.
I'm sorry. Can I?
So I see there's some little
ask a question that's
going
a little?
on in the chat.
It's probably
Does anybody have any?
A little ignorant, and I apologize.
Comments?
I just maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. CAST.
Good, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jono and Fritz, for talking. And what we want to do is, as I said, as we have our subjects for each agenda, we want to keep this, on the agenda, so each month that there's an update, more information that we're sharing, and getting feedback from the members as well. So let's move on to the registry, and let me turn it over to Steve and Mike. Steve, do you have audio? Mike, do you have audio?
Yes, I have audio, I believe.
I hope I have audio.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I do. I hear you. I hear you. And let me just, I'll just talk through, say a couple things about this slide here, and then Steve and Mike will take it over. But what we've been doing is, the method to the madness is each month we kind of cover a piece of the topics here, and we've covered account services, setup, publishing models, validation, with prior, hi Steve, prior presentations, and those are all in the TAC folder. And now we're here on maintaining and updating, and what we want to do is just keep talking through kind of all of the components each month. So with that said, with the maintaining of data in a registry, we just want to preface it with this quality slide, and you saw this at the last meeting, and it's not meant to be an all-encompassing list of every factor for quality, but it's to say that we have to have quality, and we have to be able to scale the quality, and there is a role in the registry on maintaining or helping to ensure quality. And there's also a role in kind of policy, for example, agreeing to the terms of use of the registry, and those kinds of details in terms of policy on what those terms might be in, say, currency of data, will be determined up the chain of command, probably through the Credential Engine board and executive director. So I'll just go ahead, and unless there's something that Steve or Mike you wanted to point out in this slide, I'm just going to go on to the next here.
Okay, I don't know if you want me, Steve, I can just start off and then Steve can provide details. So as indicated here last month, we discussed how the JSON validation schema is used to validate data as it comes into the registry, and this month we're focusing more on the maintenance and updating of data. So we want to make it clear, of course, the same validation will be used whenever an update is made to a credential. So the way that's done, Jeannie, next. So the CTID is a global identifier that the registries use to determine current credential, assessment, learning opportunity, etc., whether or not it exists in the registry or not. So at first it checks to see if a record exists with that CTID, and then of course it now also has to check if the public key for that existing one matches the request. So if they don't match, then it's rejected. If they do match, it's treated as an update. So it just sort of makes sure that somebody else can't use the same CTID when they're publishing data. And if you want anything, comment on that, Steve, or pretty straightforward. Okay. Okay. So, and just as a kind of a technical clarification, so the registry doesn't actually update an existing record. Instead, it creates a new version of it. And we want to have the term version and want to distinguish that from the previous version or version that's used in C2DL. That in the registry, a new version has the same CTID, and in a moment we'll see an example of that. And in C2DL, a new version is something that has a new one. So the following image shows. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, and just to
be, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Before we go to the next slide.
Yeah, so that's a good example. I wanted to point out that some people who've been familiar with Learning Registry and new versions, like we're not going down that road of every version is its own entity. Like these are just, when you publish, we record the old copy of the data and then we put the new copy over the top in the same sort of envelope structure. So both the CTID stays the same and the sort of concept of that signing envelope stays the same. So it's one entity per one Credential Engine Registry per metadata entry or entity. Just so that anyone who's familiar with the old or the alternative method isn't wondering if we're doing that here. We elected to go a different route.
Okay, so this next slide shows an example of a credentialist in the registry. You can see that there's essentially 3 versions. Originally it was created in April, and there's 2 newer versions. So there's a property called head. If it's true, then that tells you that's the current version. And the other ones, and again, as you can see, they have URLs, so you can't actually get to a previous version if there's some reason you want to compare what's changed. Again, these are versions of the same credential, so it could be as simple as a small spelling change here and there versus adding additional classes.
Right, and that will be a big issue, is making sure that people have a best practice, and different communities will probably treat this differently, of when is a credential or whatever you're publishing here an update to an existing entity, which is what this is for, and when is it actually a new credential. And so you should publish a new record, which is the version 2 credential, and there'll be community work on that issue, but I think this data system supports those.
Which is exactly the next slide. So at some level, of course, the publishers are going to decide, whether they want to update an existing credential or create a brand new one. So that's where the CTID is used. If they actually have a new credential, a new version of it that is not just an update, then they would then publish with a new CTID. So the registry would treat that as a new credential. And the CTDL has a property called previous version. So when you're publishing a new version, you can have that property contain a URI to the previous version. And as Steve just said, the concept of that is going to be obviously primarily by the publisher, but there could be some input, some community guidelines as to, as the example that Steve had here, is that a new version could be created when holders of an older version are not entitled to hold the new credentials. So there's something distinctly different about the new version. Okay, next. This thing is the currency of data. So a person or a publisher, of course, want to update their resources regularly. We want to make sure that a user has access to the most up-to-date information. So the concept is to have a service that's going to check to see if data is current. So a possibility is that when a publisher publishes, they can indicate what the equivalent of an expiry date is. This is good for 2 years or whatever, and then there'd be a registry service that would follow up in that period of your resource hasn't been updated for whatever period of time, and they encourage it to update.
this is kind of, we had talked about saying, well, maybe all credentials need to be updated every 6 months, and so just forcing everyone onto the same schedule. And we thought that it's probably better to just ask people, you know, when they publish, tell us something about the credential in terms of its expiry, and then we'll follow up with you, or we'll clean up data when people are unattending their data, you know, in a reasonable time frame. Whether the community should limit as a maximum, you know, how long can a credential maximally be set, but different people may want to set different windows, and we thought it was better to give that flexibility.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sure.
And certainly, like that example.
Sure.
Yeah, so I don't know what the maximum expiry date would be, 2 years, 4 years. Maybe you can send this credential never expires, so don't ever bug me about it. It's a permanent credential. I don't know. That's something that should be determined not by this engine, but we thought it seems useful for people who have credentials that do expire every 3 months to tell us that they do, and then for us to sort of alert them, hey, your credentials are expiring. What do you want to do about it? So that what we want to do is people who abandon credentials start out with the best intentions. We publish this thing, blah, 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 and then they abandon them. We want to be able to say, hey, this thing's clearly abandoned. Well, how do we know? Because they said it expires 6 months. It's now 12 months. We're deleting it, or whatever. We're not really deleting, but we deprecate to sort of remove it from the active sort of population of metadata. That's an issue that we've had in other metadata registries that we want to provide some mechanism here that isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all, as you're saying, Alex. Some people are going to have, you know, 2-year, 4-year, you know, long-lived credentials that they don't want to update.
Yeah, and just as we move on to the next, this next slide, but I just want to mention too that we also have, the Credential Engine has multiple advisory groups representing, you know, the various types of stakeholders in the credentialing ecosystem as well. And so this is the kind of thing that we're drafting questions to, you know, our higher advisory committee, our business committee, and so forth, to also get feedback, because as Alex, as you mentioned, they have business practices. And so we want to consider those on the one hand. On the other hand, we will, you know, likely want to implement some kind of a policy so we can feel a level of confidence that data is correct. You know, even if it's just forcing a confirmation of, yes, this is correct, you know, for the data quality. So when I mentioned quality earlier, I wasn't talking about like the quality of how good a credential is. I was talking about the data quality.
Okay, we've already kind of touched on this next slide about, we'll talk about link check in a moment, but a currency checker, so that if we have a concept of an expiry date related to a credential, then we'll have a service that checks that, and if something is near its expiry date as well as past it, then it notifies the owner of that to update. And as to what happens is just that we can be set inactive. So it's not deleted, it's still there. If the publisher comes back in another month and then doesn't update, well, then it essentially gets reactivated. Next. So when a resource is published to the registry, hopefully the URLs are active and current at that point, but we're going to have a registry service that will regularly crawl through the records in the registry, check their links to see if they're still valid. And essentially there's going to be two types of links, one that are canonical, which are really important links, like, you know, the main website for that credential, and there's supporting supplemental links. Could be as simple as you know, an image URL that's not critical to the quality of the data. Next. Okay, so for the canonical ones, so that proposal here is that if it finds something's invalid, it would try to contact the publisher. Then after a period of time, if it hasn't been resolved, the resource will be set inactive. So again, it's still updatable if the publisher then realize they missed the email or whatever, and they do an update, the resource would then get reactivated. And it's still available if they happen to know the exact URL to that entry. Next.
Right, that's a really important point that Mike and I discussed, that the idea of not deleting things but inactivating them so they don't show up in searches and other things. But if you have a piece of metadata that's referring to a credential, even if the credential is inactive, we still want that direct reference to produce metadata and sort of enable systems that were depending on that credential, because historical credentials are still valid, they're just not active. So that model might not sound right to people, so feel free to feedback as you think it through, but that's the concept, is deactivating things so that they're not actively searchable and not participating in sort of the visible metadata, but leaving their URLs open so that things that were depending on specific metadata inside those URLs can still access and function.
Okay, so that's supplemental URLs. So these are a little bit different. So again, go ahead. Go ahead, Alex. Agreed.
So Carla, we're going to get, I think, to your questions. We talked about the different models, so let's just plow through and
okay, so the next
see if we do answer.
type would be the supplemental URLs. So if something, again, as simple as an image URL is no longer valid, we don't want to certainly inactivate the whole resource. We want to be able to communicate to someone who consumes that there's some invalid or inconsistent or whatever data. So, and certainly Steve can explain this a bit further about how we would try to communicate that when someone does download or consume a resource that has data like URLs that are not valid. So one of the suggestions was that either in an envelope or in the metadata, you see a list of errors, issues, or whatever, so the consumer would know, because of course they've read all the documentation thoroughly, that they would look for that kind of information and handle it. So they could handle it simply as, well, I don't want to have any bad data, so I'm going to ignore it, or I'm going to, if the information tells me specifically what properties I should ignore, I can set them to blank or annotate it somehow saying, by the way, maybe this isn't valid. Whatever they think is important. I don't want to be changing the data, so they want to show it as however makes the best sense.
Right. So this is still a little speculative, but we believe that there's we may want to specifically flag. You really don't want to rely on these fields in this credential anymore, or this entity. Probably we're talking mostly about credentials. You really don't want to rely on these fields. Once they expire, you shouldn't be using them, and that's just sort of clues to the people consuming the metadata that maybe they want to restrict their reliance on certain fields or whatever. And it's possible we'll just say the whole darn credential is expired. That in the early days, I would guess that's the amount of nuance, but we wanted to provide some additional nuance or hints about what might be wrong with the credential once it's past its expiry date.
Okay, next. So last topic is just, I think we have touched on this before, about how the data from the registry will be regularly backed up to archive.org. There's some technical details here, but the key is that it'll be there and available to anybody who ever wants to look at old data, restore it for their own purposes. And that's it. Any last questions?
Well, there was a lot going on in the chat, and so some of these things, these questions, like Carla, really good questions, and those are the kinds of things. Well, and with our advisory groups, we're putting together a survey and a set of questions to also get feedback from the communities who are in the business, in each of the areas. We have the employer group, the higher ed group, certification license group. So we have groups that we can go to, plus our partners. And actually, if there aren't any, are there any other questions that we need to answer? Does anybody see anything in the chat that we should talk about?
Well, Carla mentioned about scraping the credentials, but at this point, I think there already would be initially some kind of relationship. We're not going to be scraping in the well. We're scraping where we have had a relationship, and that person essentially has contact information and so on.
Yeah, so it's
essentially,
they still have some kind of an account. The account would instruct us to go pull, that they're doing the pull instead of a push, and then we'll go get it, but we're going to know who they are.
That's right. Yeah, so we basically have, there's a few publisher models that were viewed last call, but the idea is you can publish raw metadata into the registry, sign it yourself to sort of cope with everything on your own. You can use a third party to publish that metadata for you. You can actually ask the Credential Registry. You can submit just the sort of the core, CTDL language metadata and ask the Credential Engine Registry to sign that stuff and publish it on your behalf. And then there's this other thing, which is Credential Engine Registry pulls the metadata from your website and signs it on your behalf. So it's just another kind of sign on your behalf service. It's not like a web scraping thing that's promiscuous and goes out and grabs whatever it can find on the web. It's really just a service that says, hey, our metadata is current and accurate on our website. Shouldn't that just be enough? And you say, yeah, we'll just add your account to the Credential Engine Registry, show it, point us to your website, and we'll go grab all your stuff and put it in the CER and maintain it for you. So that's really all we're accomplishing, Carla, with the scraping.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me move on to the very last segment here just to kind of round it out and give the usual partner update. And I do not know what happened to my slide, but when you go to the Google Drive, you will see there are percentages here, and you will see that I want to say there's now 347 credentials in the registry, so it has increased significantly since we last talked. And with that said, also just as a reminder, with having 100 credential partners and 5 QA partners, we have a lot of partners that we're tapping into. So we have all the advisory groups and with fairly large memberships and all of these partners. So we have gleaned a lot of information, from these partners across the various types of credentials. And one of the reasons we're going to see a big increase in credentials as a part of the strategy is not only to work with the partners who are picking at least one credential to test in the sandbox, but we've got some state partnerships going. And one of those partnerships is Indiana. And more specifically, that Indiana partnership is with military credentials. And so the focus area for Indiana, for the purpose of this pilot or sandbox period, though we will be working with them to move it all to production, healthcare and connections that are spanning high school, military, post-secondary, and occupational licenses. And along with those connections across all of those kinds of credentials and occupations in the military, for example, are competencies and competency frameworks. So we're really getting a lot of information through all the partners, and now having states, we're looking at it from an even higher level perspective. So it's secondary or high school, post-secondary, quality assurance licenses, like we said, the military applications, and other state partnerships are being identified. So we'll kind of keep filling you in on those. We included some more information on the follow-up with the partners. And many of you I know participated with the recent Work It app demo, and you now have accounts and you can log in and give us some feedback as well, which we welcome, keeping in mind it's a search app prototype, so it's work in progress. So how I want to conclude this little segment is to say we're still obviously working with all these partners. We still have our smaller group of 8 to 9 roadmap partners, And one of the things we're talking about is developing a vendor strategy. And so by vendors, we're kind of, broadly talking about the products, used by partners for that make the kinds of information that Credential Engine is describing available to the public. So, and we're looking for feedback from the TAC on this as well. But what we want to do is also obviously work directly with the partners, in particular the roadmap group, and to come up with an approach. So we're not saying we have developed the approach. We're saying this is where we are with that group and with you, is to look at developing the vendor strategy. So, and Bob, I know you're on. I don't know if you have audio. I don't know if you would like to say anything more about that. We don't hear you, Bob.
Hey, Ginny, no, I think you covered it really well, and we met with a few of the vendor partners, some potential ones at the past meeting, but we would really like the input of the TAC on how to actually implement this strategy.
Yeah. Okay. So we're at 11:21. We're doing good today. We got through the whole thing. With our next steps, as I prefaced the meeting with, we have quite a range of topics that will continually be, touch points back with the Technical Advisory Committee, such as the mapping project, which actually meets officially today. So we'll have a lot of information by the next meeting at the end of June on that. And we'll continue to talk about the competency components, and likely I'll even break out a whole quality section because there's so much, to quality, not just data quality in the registry, but other kinds of quality as well. That was coming up in the chat today. As we refine the CTDL, we have a couple of, 4 of these really big buckets left: earnings, employment holders, and some of the quality assurance related stuff. And so that'll be kind of this is next in queue. So we'll be talking more about that as well. And our next meeting and the next CTDL release is end of June. So anyone who wants to look at that cost manifest stuff, it's in pending, and so we're still can be changed, still can be updated. So we encourage that feedback. And anybody else have any other suggestions, topics they want to talk about, feedback that we didn't cover? The chat's still going there. While the chat's going, again, I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank the presenters, and I shouldn't really just call them presenters because they're all, actually working on things. So, but thanks to all of you who were able to talk about, share information about the work that's going on. Appreciate that a lot. All right. Well, looks like we're going to get off a few minutes early then.
Hey, Jeannie, I think there is a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Did I miss something? Sure.
Carrie, you want to just state your
Carrie
question from the Google group, or
from her email?
What is the question?
Hey there. I think Steve's going to respond in the group, so we could just keep it in email for now. It had to do with some questions on third-party registration and the actual, the relationship between issuing organizations and the actual, credential organizations in the CTDL in the registry. But I think Steve's going to address it in the group, so we can take it there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
Do my best.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see a publishing scenario where organizations would have third parties, that do things for them. That's what you're talking about, I believe. and we want to be able to support that. So good discussion.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a great, hopefully long weekend.
Thanks, Jean.
Long weekend.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.